Chapter 1. Jace. Morning in Windmere smells like boiled cabbage, burnt paper, and ambition. Mostly failed. My apartment sits above a candle shop that pretends to be a bakery. Or maybe it's the other way around. Either way, they're terrible at both, and the chimney smoke curls straight up through the cracks in my floorboards. I've tried plugging them. Once. Gave up after I accidentally summoned a moth the size of a cat. I still don't talk about that incident. The cat moth is buried in the garden behind the tailors. May it rest in peace and never return. My place is, let's call it charmingly decrepit. The wallpaper peels in these long, elegant strips, like it's trying to undress itself. The floorboards creak so dramatically you'd think they were auditioning for a ghost play. And the ceiling leaks in the exact shape of a screaming skull every time it rains. I love it here, especially in the mornings, when the city hasn't yet remembered it's supposed to crush your soul. The kettle wheezed on the stove, not quite a whistle, more like an old man sighing into his soup. I took that as a signal that the water was probably hot enough and poured it into a chipped mug that once said "World's Best Uncle." I am no one's uncle, but now just says "World's Bees," which feels appropriately vague. I dropped in a pinch of witherleaf, a questionable herb I bought from a woman who may or may not have been a cursed goose in disguise. It turned the water a murky gray purple and gave off the faint smell of regret and citrus. Delicious. Behind me, something thumped, followed by the rustle of parchment and a low, deliberate growl. "Ember," I called without turning. "If you eat my only remaining map of the northern wastes again, I swear to the dead gods I'll feed you the next one myself." A tiny, smug huff of smoke puffed past my shoulder. I turned. She was perched on the edge of the bookshelf, claws tapping rhythmically against the wood, wings tucked primly. Ember looked like a cross between a lizard, a kitten, and a particularly judgmental piece of art. She blinked her molten gold eyes slowly, then stuck out her tongue and nudged the half-chewed corner of the map toward me like a gift. "Thanks," I muttered, rescuing the parchment. "Next time bring me socks." She sneezed, a harmless puff of smoke this time, and flopped dramatically onto a pile of clean laundry. My clean laundry. Of course, she wasn't really a dragon. Not yet. Ember was what the old books called dressellings, too small to fly, too clever to ignore, and bonded to me by accident when I was 16 and bleeding too close to something sacred. Not my best decision, but definitely not my worst. Besides, she was the only creature in this entire rotting kingdom who didn't look at me like I was something dangerous. She just looked at me like I was hers. I took a long sip of my probably toxic tea and wandered to the window. The glass was stained with time and whatever had splattered against it during the Great Pigeon incident last spring. I could still see feathers sometimes when the light hit just right. Windmere stretched out below me like a badly drawn painting. Crooked rooftops, slanted chimneys, streets winding like they'd been drunk when designed. Laundry hung between buildings like surrender flags. Voices rose and fell in the alleys, hawking fish, soap, spells, and possibly unlicensed lizard meat. I tried not to think too hard about that last one. I didn't have anywhere to be today. No smuggling runs, no grimy little vaults to loot for ancient scrolls, no half-insane mages to babysit. Just a day to myself. Which, in my experience, usually meant something terrible was about to happen. But not today. Today, I would read a book I had absolutely no intention of returning to the archives. I'd feed Ember a roasted mouse and pretend she didn't like it medium rare. Maybe I'd finally try to organize the potions shelf, which currently looked like a gremlin had vomited labels all over it. I even cracked open the window. Just a little. Outside, the air was cool and soft, like the world hadn't yet remembered how cruel it could be. Ember gave a low, curious chirp behind me. I turned to find her balanced on the edge of the table, tail twitching, staring at the stack of books I'd stolen, rescued, from a fire sale in the capital. One of them pulsed faintly. Another was humming. The third just screamed occasionally, but only when left unattended. "Fine," I said, grinning, "you pick." She lunged for the screamer. Of course, after Ember tried to disembowel the screaming book, and I bribed her away from it with a sliver of salted duck, I pulled on my boots and my long, patchy overcoat that had definitely seen better decades. The lining was stitched with silver thread that sparked faintly when I moved, a charm meant to repel curses. It mostly just made me itch. Windmere was already yawning awake as I stepped outside. The streets were crooked, lined with crooked houses built by crooked men. Every building leaned slightly inward, like the city was conspiring over some long-forgotten joke. Vines draped the balconies like gossiping shawls, and little flags from last season's harvest festival still fluttered across alleyways because no one could be bothered to take them down. I passed old Misha, hunched in her rocking chair with a cat on her lap and one on her head. She gave me a nod and a wink, then spat into the street for luck. I returned the gesture with all due ceremony. That was just how it worked here. The shop to my left changed names every week. Today, the faded sign read, "Tallow and Stitch, Cursed Threads, Blessed Needles." Underneath, someone had scrawled in charcoal, "No refunds if it stabs you." I paused by Erwin's floating stall, which was only floating halfway this morning. Erwin himself, a short man with more tattoos than teeth, was selling buttered starbread and iced nettle buns that pulsed faintly with green light. "Morning, troublemaker," Erwin said, handing me a bun without waiting for coin. "Heard you broke the Academy's anti-theft ward again." "That's slander," I said, biting into the bun. It hummed gently against my tongue. It was already broken. I just accelerated the failure. He laughed like a man who'd stolen something better once, and I continued on with Ember wrapped around my shoulders like a living scarf. She purred. "Yes, dragons purr, if they like you. And if they don't, well," asked the tailor who once tried to charge me triple. He still walks with a limp. By the time I reached Greenroot Row, the street musicians were tuning their instruments, a fire flute, a stringless harp, and a boy who could whistle in three-part harmony with himself. A woman nearby sold floating candles scented like stormwater and old poetry. She smiled at me, and I smiled back, a rare luxury I didn't often indulge. Magic thrived here, in the cracks. Not the crown's clean, polished kind. Not the sort taught in marble towers or stored in silver runes. This was hedge magic, street-born, woven into love letters and lullabies. The kind of enchantment that didn't ask permission, it simply was. There was an alley behind the clockmakers that always smelled like vanilla when it rained. A door on Brood Street that only opened for liars. A lamplighter who hadn't aged in 60 years, but claimed to have no magic at all. Even the cobblestones were alive in their own way. I once tripped over a particularly moody one that refused to sit flat unless I whispered a compliment. "Good morning, city," I murmured aloud. "Please don't kill me today." A nearby weather vane spun twice and then stopped. Good omen. I bought a book of riddles from a talking crow, argued with a wind spirit about the ethics of umbrellas, and watched a girl teach her pet toad how to dance. Ember charred a pigeon out of sheer boredom, and I had to bribe a street cleaner to look the other way. By the time the sun reached its lazy peak, I was sitting on the mossy ledge overlooking Worms Hollow, a long stretch of grassland outside the city where old bones still slept beneath the earth. Ember dozed on my lap, twitching occasionally like she was dreaming of chasing skyfish. I traced idle shapes into the dirt with my boot, thinking of nothing and everything. No one was trying to kill me. Nothing was on fire. There were no visions, no screams, no messages from ancient gods. Just sunlight, and silence, and the weight of a dragonling purring like thunder against my ribs. I could almost believe it would stay this way. Almost. I stayed at the overlook longer than I meant to, watching the cloud shadows move over the hills like drifting thoughts. Worms Hollow was still, but there was something about it that always made me feel like the land remembered. Like it knew. The grass grew taller there than anywhere else in the kingdom, and in spring it turned silver blue and shimmered like water. That's where the old dragons fell, the ones from stories too ancient for scrolls. They say if you press your ear to the dirt, you can hear them dreaming still. I'd never been brave, or stupid, enough to try. Ember stretched, jaw opening in a wide yawn that showed off teeth far too large for her body. Then she sneezed directly into my lap and looked deeply proud of herself. Great. Perfect. Now I smell like sulfur and roasted plum, I muttered, brushing ash off my coat. She flopped down again, completely unbothered. Eventually, I stood. The cobbled path back toward the city was warm under my boots, and the gentle slope of the street made it feel like the city was welcoming me back with open arms. Or possibly dragging me by the collar. I stopped at Marlowe's Paper and Strange, the best little curiosity shop in the 3rd District. The bell above the door didn't ring so much as whisper secrets in a language no one understood. Ember always hissed at it. I pretended I wasn't a little unnerved. Back so soon? Marlowe called from somewhere behind a stack of talking scrolls that were arguing about correct grammar. Don't flatter yourself, I said. I came for ink. Ah, she said, appearing from nowhere, cheeks stained with charcoal and something that looked like jam. Dark blood or moon fade? Neither, I said. Just regular. Boring. Black. She looked at me like I'd asked for porridge at a feast. How tragically dull. I shrugged. So am I. Marlowe grinned. Liar. Ember made a low chirping noise and leapt onto the counter, scattering a pile of rune stones. One landed upright and glowed faintly. Oh no, I said. Marlowe peered at the symbol. Huh, what do you mean huh? She didn't answer. Instead, she gave me a bundle wrapped in brown paper and whispered, try not to open that around mirrors. Is this ink? Depends on how you use it. I sighed and dropped a few copper scales on the counter. This is why I can't take you anywhere. Because I give you gifts. Because you once cursed a spoon to bark every time someone used it for soup. She raised an eyebrow, and it was funny every single time. She wasn't wrong. By the time I left the shop, the streets had shifted again. Windmere does that sometimes. The buildings move. Just slightly. Enough to confuse tourists and misplace entire neighborhoods. I didn't mind. I liked that the city had a pulse of its own. That it got bored and rearranged itself just to see who noticed. I headed home through Glimmer Row, where the cobblestones shimmered with leftover glamour from the last solstice parade. A street performer danced in a suit of living vines, and a small boy beside him was levitating 6 apples while trying to juggle them with magic that stuttered every few seconds. One of the apples hit me in the face. I gave him a silver coin anyway. You missed, I said. He grinned like he'd won a duel. Back at my apartment, I kicked the door open and was immediately greeted by the smell of ink, herbs, old wood, and the faint, ever-present scent of dragon. Ember bolted ahead and launched herself into a sunlit patch on the floor, where she rolled onto her back and flailed happily like an overgrown, scaly cat. I dumped my bag onto the couch. Something inside it growled. I ignored it. Then I stood in the middle of my room, mug of tea back in hand, lukewarm now, but still vaguely magical, and looked around. The floating shelf had rearranged itself again. The plants in the windowsill were whispering about the weather. My enchanted coat had migrated to the bookshelf for some reason. But it was home, crooked, cursed, unpredictable, and mine. Tomorrow, maybe, there would be danger. There would be letters I didn't want to read. A summons from the crown. A strange knock at the door. A choice. But not today. Today, there was nothing but sun and dust and the quiet hum of a city that was, for once, content to let me be. And Ember, stretched out like royalty in the light, gave a soft, satisfied snore.